I want you to think about it for a minute. No, it's just going to sit there, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. It's called, getting your attention. We're going to be talking about life together, and one of the things that, as we look at it over the next couple of weeks, Tom, you got a couple days? I found out about this yesterday in about the middle of the day when Jake twisted his knee and said, hey, I'm not sure I can get up on stage. And so Greg and I were looking at it, and it's like I was the first person to raise my hand. If I had waited another 30 seconds, Greg would be preaching. But that's great because I was scheduled to preach next week too, so you're going to put up with me for 2 weeks. What Jake and I had talked about in terms of merging these together was really important. As he was kind of give the theological idea, and then next week I was going to start putting some feet on it. On what are we going to do as a church to do that? So now I got to try to figure out how to do that and not merge too much over and bleed across and all of that. And my brain is not precise enough not to do that, and so it tends to flow. But we start our service, our sermon, recently. Jake has been starting with prayer, and the VIP prayer. But what I want us to look at for a minute is the idea that as we do life together, having one person pray kind of misses that. So I'm going to ask you to pray. So I'm going to ask for 3 volunteers. One of them is to do that prayer for the VIP, that very important person that God is putting in your heart to share the gospel with. So do I have a volunteer? Okay, great. Okay. Second one is someone to pray for Jake and for healing. Okay? That this really slows him down, and I know that as we talked earlier this week a couple times that he's excited about where we're going, and that's maybe it's one of those ones where God said, I need you to slow down and think a bit. But for the healing and all that. So who will pray for Jake? Okay. And then Jamie. With what's happened with Jake, that puts an extra burden on Jamie. Yes? Okay? And all that, and all those things that just, can you get me this, can you get that, and all that. So there's somebody to pray for Jamie for strength and for patience. Okay, thank you. So if we just do those in that order, let's pray. Amen. So our table. When we look at this table here, this is to represent, because it is with the table that we use to hold our communion. And back in the early churches, we would have a table that held the communion and all of that. And guess where they put it? Right here in the middle. And then what happened was, over time, as the church moved away from being a house church movement, and we had house churches, and we knew that they were house churches because we've actually found a few of them. We look at them, and what they've done is taken a house that was about the size of this room, and they'd knocked the walls out, and then we'd see the mosaic on the floor was a Christian mosaic. And we'd have some paintings on the walls, and this was a New Testament church. And in the middle was a table. And it was a table that had the communion on it. But when we go back and we look in Corinthians, what we see is a story about where Paul's being a little bit testy towards some of the Corinthians, and he's like, some of you are bringing huge meals and all that, and some are starving. And it appears that as they did communion, they did it the same way that Jesus did the Last Supper. It was in the context of a meal. And basically, church was always a potluck. Except that it wasn't originally a potluck. You didn't come and put your food for everybody. You brought your food. And then some people were having elaborate, and then the poor people were eating their gruel in the corner and starving. And he said, this is not right. But it was all in the middle as we joined in. And as time went on, we started seeing some changes in the church. Church architecture started getting bigger. We started building dedicated buildings, but actually the earliest dedicated buildings, we still find the altar in the middle. Everybody stood. They didn't have pews. I don't know how long they met, but probably for hours. And they were all in a circle. And the reason I want to do the prayer the way I did this morning is that there's just sort of some passing references that we pick out about how church looked like in the New Testament. You know, when he says things like, if any of you has something to say. We got an email earlier this week on who was going to have something to say. You got to put up with me. Okay? Does that make sense? And if someone really has a strong view, they might do that, but this isn't set up to be that way. When we come in and we say, who's going to lead worship, we look up here and see who's up here to lead worship. We look up here to see who's going to be speaking. And so what happens is we have all the chairs no longer facing each other. We're all facing one direction. And we start becoming consumers of church. We come in, put on the show, and I walk out going, oh, that was great, or didn't do much for me this week, or whatever. Does that make sense? And things got even worse over time. As the church became more and more hierarchical, one of the things that started to happen, and part of the reason this architecture happened, is the church became less interested in the mission of the church and more in controlling the church and establishing boundaries. Ever heard of the Council of Nicaea? What was it about? Go back in church history, and what we find is as Constantine has decided that he's going to become a Christian, and when the emperor becomes a Christian, it de facto becomes the national religion. He didn't officially declare that. That was a few emperors later that declared it as the empire's official religion. But it was going to become the de facto religion when he does that. And the problem is he looks out across the Roman world and he's like, you all don't do this all together. I mean, in a sense, all the same. So he calls them in, and essentially what it's there to do is decide what are the boundaries of Christianity so this can function as an empire religion. Constantine doesn't really care what they believe, just as long as they all believe together and he can keep control of it all. Does that make sense? And the hierarchy of the church begins to develop to look that way. It's less about mission and more about maintaining control. And so what happens is they come up with this. Priest stands at the front, at the altar. Everybody sit there, do as you're told. Make sense? Then it gets even more. Eventually, this goes here. Against the back wall. And the reason it goes there is so that when the priest is beginning to consecrate communion for everybody, the priest turns his back on the congregation. And no longer are we looking at a movement that's built around a common table, a common place, and a thing that makes sense to say something. If anybody has something to say, here's how you should say it. Does that make sense? And so what happens is we become consumers of church. And so then we have all kinds of programs of how do we get people out of the pew and into ministry, out of the pew and into ministry. And there are books and things and all kinds of stuff all over the place. And it starts with us having kind of a flawed view of how church ought to be. And so we have this, and I don't know, without sort of knocking some walls out and changing some things around, we're kind of here. But we can do other things. So at my school, we have 2 commercial kitchens. We've got a commercial kitchen in the cafeteria, and the purpose of that commercial kitchen in the cafeteria is to feed the kids. Does that make sense? So if we're going to look at the success of that kitchen, the question is, if you're a student and you walk in, what do you say? Did I get fed? That make sense? Our students who are coming in to that commercial kitchen are coming in to get fed. And there's a small group of people who work very hard to make sure the kids get fed. Right? And the majority of the people who are there, that's not what they're there for. But we have another kitchen on our campus. That's our Culinary Institute. And that's where we're teaching students how to feed others. How different do you judge that one? When you walk in and you see the people who are working in the cafeteria, they're not busy trying to teach anybody anything. They're just trying to get the food ready, because at 11:02, that mob is going to show up, right? And we got to be ready. But we go into the culinary kitchen, and there I see the teacher as he's in there saying, "Here's how you slice vegetables without slicing your fingers too." Okay? Here's how you prepare this. Here's how you saute. Here's the temperature you want to look for. Here's the thing, all that. And then, that's the rough part of my job is once in a while I have to go in and test out how they did. Yeah, the sacrifices we make. And then judge how they did and all that. It's a fantastic thing on that. Which one is the model of what the church ought to be? Let me read you something. Problem was I switched Bibles this morning because I can read this one easier. Now I got to try to figure out where I am at. This is from Ephesians 4. As a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's body for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So my question is, I read that. Which one of those 2 kitchens is Paul describing? The one that delivers food or the one that teaches people how to deliver food. It's the Culinary Institute. The church is not a restaurant. And as a pastor, and I would guess that the other pastors in the room here share this one, whenever I had somebody come and visit my church and they're thinking about coming to my church, and then they start talking about their old church, and I just wasn't being fed. And we got some verses in the Bible where he's talking about people, and he's like, you're still drinking milk, and by now you should be teachers. We shouldn't come to church to be fed. We should come to church to learn how to feed. And the normal Christian life is to become one who feeds others. That's the normal progression in the church. But we have some barriers that we need to overcome. One of them is this. It unconsciously teaches us to be consumers and to judge what happened in church around how did I do? How did I feel? How was that for me? Same way I do when I go into a theater and watch the movie or watch the play. How did I enjoy it? We unconsciously walk through that same model and then miss the idea, where do we go? And what do we do? If you really want to have an incredible God experience, it's never going to be on the receiving end. It's going to be in that moment when you were sharing grace with someone else and you realized the God of the universe chose this moment to work through you. And that's when it's amazing. There's nothing on the receiving end that can match that one. And so as we, again, I'm not going to leave you with the, oh, you ought to do this. Next week, we're going to start talking about how we're going to go do it. Hold that thought. And May 5th, the first Sunday of the month, save that time right after service. That's where we're going to invite you to dive in. Okay? So, hint on the future on that. An interesting thing. How often I got to figure out where I put it. There we go. How often in the Bible does it tell us to gather together? A command to, don't forget doing this. We have a lot of passages where it's just sort of like, the church gathered together. But it's not in a command structure. Does that make sense? There's really only one that I've found where there is a command to gather. Anybody know where it is? It's in Hebrews, okay? And I want you to catch this one because it's really subtle on what he says. It's great to have Greg here. Let us hold unswervingly, I'm starting at verse 23 in chapter 10. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he has promised to be faithful. And let us to consider how we may spur one another on to love and good deeds. Let us not give up the meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another all the more as you see the day approaching. So according to that, why do you go to church? To encourage someone, right? I don't go to receive, I go to give. Ever gone to church? This is Richard's theory, okay? This may or may not have any validity, but I'll share it, okay? Ever gone to church and come back and go, something was missing, right? My theory. There was somebody who was snoozing in bed that morning who God had called to come and encourage you. And they didn't come and encourage you. I love the story of a guy who's talking about having a dream, and he dreams that he died. And he goes, and he's first taken to hell. And he's expecting fire and brimstone and all that stuff, and he walks in, and there is this amazing banquet laid out. And everybody's sitting at the table and there's this amazing banquet. But the challenge is everybody, all the silverware has a cover over your hand, and it's 3 feet long. And they're all sitting there trying to eat, and they can't get anything in their mouth because this thing just doesn't work. And so they're flipping food all over the place, and it's a mess, and there's this awesome food, and they're not getting a bite to eat. And it's so frustrating. But then he's taken to heaven, and he walks in, and there's this huge banquet laid out. And everybody's sitting there with the silverware that covers their hand, and it's 3 feet long. And they're feeding each other. That's the church. We are blessed when we feed each other, and then we get fed. But if I come in with and this is one of those places where it's just sort of, it's an Americanism, we consume everything we touch. And so we end up trying to figure out how to consume church. And then get frustrated. Because it doesn't work. But when I get into that thing where I'm doing this and I'm feeding others and all of that, that's when it becomes incredibly joyful. And we do life together. One of the people that I know the best in terms of, how they think, how their heart and all that in the room here is Greg. So how is it that I ended up knowing Greg so well? What do you think? We went to Tanzania. Right, 40 hours on the airplane getting there. You got a lot of time to talk. And sit in the airport and all that, you begin to understand. And then we get out there and discover that we have two very different personalities. I'm really good at that, react to whatever comes up. Which also tends to mean I put stuff off and then react to whatever comes up. Greg plans well in advance. And then suddenly we were in a situation where those things were playing together. And God was using us. And Greg was really having to stretch himself because, it was one of those ones that we'd pull out in the vehicle and we're supposed to turn right to go back to the mission compound, and they're turning left. Where are we going? Oh, we got another one for you. Okay, and so Greg and I are sitting in the back seat going, what are we going to do? Which honestly was more often than that. I'm asking, what are we going to do? Greg thinks for a few minutes, says, here, I got an idea. Pulls out his notebook. Here you go. That was the reality of the way it really went. Greg and I did ministry together. We walk together. If you go look in the New Testament, what you see is there's very few times we see someone doing solo ministry. Happens once in a while. But look at Paul. When God calls Paul to be an apostle and it's time for Paul to go out, he doesn't go out alone. He goes out with Barnabas. And then as time goes on, he's out with Silas and he's with Timothy, and you start reading in the letters and how many other people that when Paul said, it's time for me to go do ministry, he said, come with me. Let's do ministry together. This is better together than it is solo. And that's where we will learn how to do this. And I am so excited about what we've got coming up over the next few months. It's going to take us a year to roll this thing out. And as things come looping back around, one of the loose ends that I had as we were looking at it was how we were going to organize our the core theological discipleship piece. I had lost all of that I had done in the past. Couldn't find any of the files. And then God works with that. So last Sunday, I'm sitting and I'm talking to my niece. And she's been children's minister and other outreach minister and that kind of stuff for several churches. And she said, go look up Rooted. Okay. So I go look up Rooted. And I discover that its original name wasn't Rooted. It was Mzizi. It's a Swahili word for root. And it came from East Africa.